So yeah, welcome to our talk, All Cops Are Broadcasting, Breaking TETRA After Decades in the Shadows. I'm very excited to stand here today and share this research with you after working on it for more than 2 years. My name is Wetzels, and these are my colleagues, Wouter Bokslag and Carlo Meijer, and together we form Midnight Blue. We're a specialist security consultancy firm based in the Netherlands who mainly focus on embedded systems as well as critical infrastructure security. So what is TETRA? TETRA is a globally used radio technology that competes with the likes of P25, DMR, and the confusingly named TETRAPOL, which is a different standard, by the way. It was standardized in 1995 by ETSI, that's the European Telecommunication Standards Institute, or known for GSM, 3G, 4G, and so on. It's used for voice and data communication, as well as machine-to-machine communications. And what's interesting about it is that it relies on secret proprietary cryptography, which is why we're standing here today. So who uses TETRA? The vast majority of the world's global police forces use TETRA for their handheld and mobile radio communications systems. And this goes for police forces in the Netherlands, in Germany, the United Kingdom, the Scandinavian countries, Eastern Europe, as well as vast majority of countries in South America, as well as Asia. It's also used in military units, as well as intelligence agencies in various capacities. Now, the countries you see on the slide here are ones we could confirm through open source intelligence, but this is likely just the tip of the iceberg of TETRA usage in these contexts. And on top of that, it's also used in critical infrastructure. So many parties, such as harbors, airports, and train stations, have private security forces who communicate a lot of the cases through TETRA radios. And in addition, TETRA is used as a wide area networking radio link to carry SCADA telecontrol communications, such as the control of high voltage substations, oil and gas pipelines, as well as railway signaling. So serious stuff is where this is used. Now, a common misconception is that TETRA is an open standard, which is not actually the case. The standard, parts of it are public, but the cryptography is kept secret. Now, this is only available under non-disclosure agreements, which you can only sign if you're a bona fide party. And the manufacturers who make this equipment must protect the algorithms by either implementing them in hardware or implementing them in software with the proper extraction countermeasures. The problem here at the very start is that there are a lot of bona fide vendors, and they're geographically dispersed. So every major country has a TETRA manufacturer, the UK, the US, China, Russia. And as such, it's very likely that top-tier adversaries already have these specifications, and they didn't have to jump through the kind of hoops that we had to jump through to get to these algorithms. Now, TETRA security has two main pillars, the first of which is TAA1, which is used for authentication, key management and distribution, as well as identity encryption. And the second one is TEA, not to be confused with the tiny encryption algorithm. It's the TETRA encryption algorithm suite, which is used for voice and data encryption over the air. And there's 4 algorithms here, starting with TEA1, which is readily exportable. Then you have TEA2, which is used for European public safety. Then you have TEA3, which is used for those cases where TEA2 would be applicable but is not available. So that's mainly countries who are outside the EU but have good geopolitical relationships with them. And then there's TEA4, which is the same use case as TEA1, but it's hardly used in practice. Optionally, there are TETRA end-to-end solutions which can be bolted on top of the air interface encryption, but these are only used by some countries and in very special cases. So think about special intervention units within police forces rather than the entire police force itself. These are not part of the TETRA standard itself. There's some guidelines there, but these are vendor-specific proprietary solutions. And again, these are very opaque. They're also closed. People don't know on the outside how they work. And with this in mind, we undertook a project that we call Project Re-TETRA in order to delve into TETRA for the first time in more than 20 years. Now, I probably don't have to explain people here what Kerckhoffs's principle is, but I'm still going to do it anyway. Kerckhoffs's principle states that a crypto system should be secure even if everything about the system except for the key is public knowledge, right? No security through obscurity. Why? Because violators don't fare well. What we've seen in the past is that secret cryptography, as used in GSM, as used in satellite phones, as used in GPRS, all ETSI standards by the way, was either weak or has been backdoored. And the same you can say for a lot of proprietary RFID ciphers. ETSI thinks differently about this. In his interview with the journalist Kim Zetter, Brian Murgatroyd, who's the chairman of the ETSI Technical Commission on TETRA, said, well, obscurity is also a way of maintaining security. Let's see if that's actually the case. So we undertook this project to really delve into this standard because, I mean, it's used in a lot of critical areas, as I mentioned. And we approached the NLNet Foundation, which is a Dutch nonprofit which funds open source research. And they made some money available for us to look into this system, obtain these algorithms, and analyze them for the first time. And to discuss that a little bit is my colleague, Wouter Bokslag, who will take you a little bit further in this journey.
Thanks. So, as he also explained, we wanted to do a security analysis of the TETRA standard, and we could not get our hands on the specifications themselves because it would involve NDAs. So what we decided is that we would pick a radio and then reverse engineer the algorithms out of the radio. Now, there's protection mechanisms in place, so it wasn't going to be easy. First step would be procurement. You have to get an idea of which vendors are active in the space, which models are available, and identify a model that seems to be the most plausible and offer the best return on investment for a reverse engineering process. Then you will have to really dive into this model, properly understand how it's put together, how it works internally, and most importantly, where the secret TETRA cryptography resides inside this radio. Next, you will have to develop various zero-day attacks in order to break through various layers of the system in order to be able to exfiltrate the secret cryptography from the radio, and then you can start doing what you actually wanted to do, and that is analyze the security of TETRA itself. So in our case, we opted for the Motorola MTM5400 radio, which is a common off-the-shelf model, and it's based on a Texas Instruments SoC, the OMAP L138. And this SoC embeds two cores internally. There's an ARM core, an application processor, and there's a DSP core that does the more low-level signaling, low-level processing stuff. And inside this DSP, there is a trusted execution environment. So the firmware contains the secret TETRA crypto in an encrypted form, and only inside the TE it is decrypted to make available for use by the DSP, but it's not visible by most of the code running on the DSP. So we started analyzing the serial interface on the rear of the radio, which implements a modem command interface, AT modem commands. We found a format string vulnerability there. We exploited it. We gained control over the ARM core. Then we had to move laterally towards the DSP. We thought this would be quite a headache because of the weird architecture of the DSP. But we found that memory protection units were not properly configured, so the ARM core was allowed to just write into DSP memory, override DSP code, so that was very straightforward. And then we had to break the trusted execution environment, which we did by exploiting a timing side channel in the AES decryption of the cryptographic module that's loaded in the TE. More details on this will be given at our DevCon talk. For time, we will now continue, but I expect to see you there. For now, we will continue with discussing the secret TETRA primitives that we uncovered and extracted from the radio, and we will perform an initial security analysis. And this is quite a special day because the actual implementations of the primitives will be made available on GitHub very shortly. So after the talk, you will be able to look at it yourself. So first, we uncovered the algorithms of TAA1, which implements authentication. And what we found is that everything that is in the standard described as a TA something block is based on the hurdle cipher, which is a 16-round Feistel cipher that uses 64-bit blocks and a 128-bit key. And the things that are labeled in the standard as TB are really simple functions based on XOR and addition, usually. What you see here, for instance, is how an authentication would work within TETRA. Also interesting is that we found that some blocks that had different names were either identical or very closely related. So that brings us to our first attack. In this schematic, you see how the infrastructure and the radio can mutually authenticate each other. They generate random challenges, and they prove their knowledge of a shared secret K by means of a challenge response algorithm. And the authentication also generates a DCK, which is a session key that's then used for encryption of data. And having obtained the implementations of the primitives, we could simplify this a bit. We found that TA21 is actually identical to TA12, except that RS, a random seed provided by the infrastructure, is loaded in reverse byte order. Also, we found that TA22 is identical to TA12, so they have different labels, but they are just the same. Lastly, we found that TB4, which combines two partial session keys into the final session key, is just XOR of both keys. So we can further simplify the derivation of this session key. And we can construct an attack here. So let's assume we impersonate the infrastructure and we target a radio. And let's also assume that we can predict the random number that the mobile station will generate. Now, this might seem a bit far-fetched, but in embedded systems, random number generation is quite hard, and this is feasible far more often than you would like to. As an impersonator of the infrastructure, we can provide RS, and we can just choose one that is a palindrome. So it is, in the reverse direction, it is identical to the forward direction. And in that case, we can even further simplify the DCK derivation to something that has the same things on the left and the right sides of the XOR. And by nature of XOR, that means that the session key we end up with will be all zeros. So without knowledge of the master secret key, we can obtain an authenticated session with a radio with a known key. Next thing we want to cover is identity encryption. Identity encryption is implemented in a primitive called TA61. TETRA uses these 24-bit identities that you could compare to a phone number, and they are encrypted before they go over the air in order to provide some privacy guarantees. It's not a very elaborate scheme in the first place because it offers pseudonymity. These encrypted identities remain the same over a long period of weeks or often more until a certain network key is changed. But still, it does kind of protect the identity of who is talking at that point and to who traffic is addressed. We cannot disclose the implementation at this point due to some disclosure concerns, but we will publish them in December. And we will present the attack in order to have an informed discussion on its security. So what we found is that this network key, the CCK, is used in a hurdle encryption to generate an intermediate secret that is displayed here as C. And it's a 64-bit intermediate secret that is then used for the encryption of the 24-bit identity. And that means that if as an attacker you can obtain a few pairs of an unencrypted identity together with the corresponding encrypted identity, you can do a meet-in-the-middle attack, where you start computing forward from the unencrypted one, compute backwards from the encrypted one, and meet in the middle and see what seems to be coherent with both. In that way, you can mount an attack that recovers this intermediate secret C in about a minute on common off-the-shelf hardware. And this can be quite problematic depending on the use case of the particular TETRA network discussed. These identities are often distributed in ranges, in blocks. So you could have that your general police forces use a certain range. You can have that intervention teams use another range. Firefighters use yet another range. So as an adversary, you can invest some effort in identifying which ranges corresponds with which use cases, and then do your own analysis based on what you see happening in your proximity. So this can be interesting in a counterintelligence capacity. It can also provide organized crime with an early warning if they see that intervention units start being present in an unusual amount in their proximity. So this can actually be used in practice. There are some actual applications for this kind of stuff. Also, the hardware you need to both attack the key and then listen on the TETRA network to see what's near are really cheap. And yeah. So now let's discuss encryption of the actual TETRA traffic. As Jos pointed out, this is done by one of 4 primitives, TEA1 through 4, and they all share a similar structure. Displayed here is TEA2. We have looked at it, and to us it seems robust, but we are not cryptographers, so we really would like to call for further help from professional cryptanalysts to establish whether this is a safe primitive to use. But now it gets real interesting, because we found that TEA1, while it shares the same overall structure, it starts out with a secret reduction step. And the first thing TEA1 does is compress the 80-bit key into a 32-bit register, like a reduced key, and then it only uses this reduced key for the generation of key stream with which messages are subsequently encrypted. And that means that you can just brute force these 32 bits, and then you get a key that works on the frequency you were listening on. This attack is really easy to mount. It takes about a minute on common off-the-shelf hardware, and it's probably going to, such a key is probably going to last you a while. And I will now demonstrate this attack in a small video.
The second demonstration shows how to decrypt communications of a TEA1 encrypted network, commonly used by critical infrastructure and commercial parties.
This should have been confidential.
The demonstration is carried out by us on a real network. The attacker captures traffic and identifies messages on which to mount the attack. Now the attacker computes the key used on this frequency. This takes about a minute. The attacker can now decrypt all traffic or partake in voice or data communication.
This should have been confidential.
Technical details follow on August 9th.
That's today. Thank you. So, that sounds really straightforward, right? Well, Etsy, in the interview you also mentioned before with the chair of the technical committee, had some things to say on this. First, they say we use very high-powered hardware in order to mount this attack. In my opinion, a GTX 1080 is not very high-powered, but hey, opinions, right? Probably more worrisome, he said that he assumes that 32 bits of key entropy was enough in the 90s when this stuff was standardized, and that you would need some pretty reasonable equipment in order to be able to attack this. Yeah, I think we all know that that is a bit of a weird thing to say and not completely true. But hey, why would we make assumptions here? Why would we use reasonable equipment? Why not just see what this bad boy can do?
Vulnerabilities, consisting of 5 vulnerabilities in the TETRA radio standard, 2 of which are deemed critical. Since then, Etsy, the standardization body responsible for TETRA, has made public statements in which they downplay the seriousness of the vulnerabilities. In these statements, they resorted to a semantic discussion, not calling a spade, or more specifically, not calling a backdoor a backdoor. Furthermore, they made a number of evidently false statements, such as claiming packet injection in TEA1 encrypted networks would be impossible, and that 32 bits of cryptographic strength would have been sufficient in the late 90s. To any information security expert, it's pretty clear that this is not the case. But to help remove those few remaining doubts, we decided to take on the challenge of cracking TEA1 on this beautiful machine produced in 1998, running good old Windows 95. Frankly, the hardware is so old that it wasn't easy to get our hands on. When we run the cracking tool, we see it reports that it needs about 13 hours to go through the entire search space. After 12.5 hours, the key is found, demonstrating the feasibility of cracking TEA1 on 90s consumer hardware. All right, Etsy, now that we've cleared up this issue, please let us know if you'd like us to demonstrate packet injection as well.
Thanks.
All right. All right. So yeah, that's TEA1, right? Like, it's supposed to be weak. So if your network is running TEA2, TEA3, everything's all right, right? If not so much to worry about. Yeah, think again. So the air interface is encrypted, it's supposed to be encrypted. But we found a protocol level issue that allows us to sort of like bypass it in a sense. So an encrypted message is prefixed with this unencrypted MAC header. And this MAC header contains like the destination, so whether or not this message is intended for you, the message length, like high-level stuff like that. And then there's the LLC header, and from the LLC header onward, everything's encrypted. What's important to realize here is that this message is fully malleable. It's not authenticated in any reasonable, in any sensible means. It's just whenever you decrypt the message and it seems to make sense, then I guess it's legit. That's how we roll here. Okay. Now the way the keystream generator works is obviously you have a keystream generator, you have a key, and then there's an IV, and the IV consists of frame numbers or network time, if you will. Okay, so the problem here is that when a radio comes online, which frame number is it going to be using? It doesn't know, so it just gets told by the infrastructure in an unauthenticated, unencrypted fashion. So basically, well, I guess you already can see what's going on here. There's these two kinds of frames, sysinfo and sync, which basically tell the radio what frame number to use. And therefore, we can pretty much tell it exactly which IV to use in a keystream generation. Okay, so the way the attack will work is we first passively capture some interesting encrypted message at time t, let's say. And so you could do that, for example, by sitting outside of a police station, just passively grabbing me from the air. Okay, and then later on, we just go back to this radio or another one, which shares the same key material. Doesn't really matter which one you pick. And then you just overpower the signal of the legitimate infrastructure. And then you tell it to use the keystream at time t where we first captured this message. And then somehow we need to lure this radio into releasing its keystream of that time. Now this somehow, we'll get to that now. Okay, so suppose that we already know a part of a keystream that we're after. Let's say, let's call that a bootstrap keystream, and we'll get to that later, how we get that. And this thing is n bits long. So now we construct a message of n plus 1 bits, and we make sure that this message is of the type that it requires a checksum, an FCS frame check sequence, and it requires to be acknowledged by the radio. So we still need one more additional keystream bit, so we're going to guess that's a 0. And we're just then going to send out this frame to the radio. And when this guess was correct, then the checksum will be correct. And the radio will acknowledge the message. But if the keystream bit guess was wrong, then the radio will silently discard the message. In either way, we learn what the bit is supposed to be. And we could just rewind backwards, rinse and repeat. And this way, we can recover the entire keystream. OK, so how do we get this bootstrap keystream? So it turns out that if you send a 5-bit message to a radio, depending on the first 4 bits, it will send out an acknowledgement or drop the message. So you can just brute force these 4 bits. It's only 16 combinations. And whichever turns out to be the one that gets acknowledged, that one clearly decrypts to this particular value that's known in clear text. So you just recovered 4 bits of keystream. Okay, so that's only 4 bits, but we need 37 of them. So what we do then is like we recover 4 consecutive keystreams for 4 consecutive timestamps. And then we basically chop up this 37-bit message into chunks of 10 bits, right? And then we construct this message and we lay it over these we encrypt it with all these different fragments, and we use MAC layer fragmentation to tell the radio like the next part of this message is coming after this one, etc., etc. And then the radio will stitch these chunks together back again, and it will check the checksum, and if it's correct, then it will acknowledge. And this way we can just mount the previously explained attack on one of these fragments. Okay, so this is what we told ETSI, quite in an early stage. And they were quite happy with this theoretical attack, but it didn't really seem like any practicality to it. But we didn't really have a proof of concept here. So what we're going to do, like, can you provide us maybe with a base station so we both know whether or not this is a big deal? No. So that didn't happen. Also, stakeholding parties were a bit reluctant in doing this. So yeah, we ended up purchasing a base station. So there it is. So obviously we had to get code execution on this thing, which we did, and we found some vulnerabilities in it, and we wrote a nice module loading framework for it, and then we turned this baby into our attack platform. So that looks kind of like this.
Hi, we are Midnight Blue. We have uncovered several serious vulnerabilities in the TETRA radio standard, .TETRA bus. We will first demonstrate a decryption oracle attack to recover a text message, but the attack can also be applied to voice communication and data. The demonstration takes place on our lab setup. The radio receives an encrypted message, which is also captured by the attacker. We see the message says secret. The attacker now needs to target a radio and impersonate the infrastructure and carry out the attack to decrypt the previously captured message. We have sped up this process. The attacker has now recovered all he needs to decrypt the message. This attack applies to all TETRA configurations, but can be resolved with a firmware update. Further details will be disclosed on August 9th.
All right, so we thought this would be a big deal, right? Like we can not only listen into tier 1 encrypted networks, but we can basically wiretap the police. So the only thing that ETSI had officially commented on this particular issue was, yeah, the research uncovered some general areas of improvement in the TETRA protocol. Right. Moving on. Also, there's this tier 3 algorithm for police and military outside of Europe. And what it does is, like, this has this interesting property. The S box is not a permutation. So it turns out that 2 bytes map to the same value, and if you flip a bit in one of those, it is a permutation again, and the cryptographic properties of the S box seem to align more closely with tier 2 and tier 1. So it's not really clear why this is happening. Also, like, the consequences of this get mitigated by a change in the structure of the algorithm, which is not found in tier 1 and tier 2. So this is definitely an interesting one to keep an eye on. But still, we don't have a practical attack for this. So how about the vulnerability disclosure? We started work on this project in January 2021. We spent about 4 months in getting our hands on these primitives. And then we developed attacks for this, proof of concepts, and at the end of that year, we reported it to the Dutch National Cybersecurity Center. And in January 2022, we had a first meeting with the parties involved, like police and ETSI. And in February 2022, we developed this document in which we written down basically everything that we presented today. So mitigations. Well, the keystream recovery attack can be fixed by the firmware update, so that's easy. But do keep in mind that all of your radios need to be updated, otherwise the network as a whole is still vulnerable. The TEA1 backdoor, that's a hard one. That's a hard nut to crack because you need to upgrade your cipher, which means firmware updates for the entire fleet of radios and base stations, and you probably should do that overnight. The de-anonymization attack, there is basically no fix because it's in the protocol, so you need to wait for a new protocol, or you need to, like, obfuscate the identities a bit. That's something you could do. And for the DCK pinning attack, firmware updates would also mitigate that issue. Right.
All right, thank you for that, Carlo. So in the aftermath of disclosing these issues, there were some interesting discussions with ETSI which we'd like to highlight. So in the interview with the journalist Kim Zetter, the ETSI TETRA chairman, said a couple of things. And one of them is, I would suggest that anyone who needed high security would be using TEA2. And they essentially claim that, nobody in Europe, they're using TEA1 for police and military situations. But we found public tenders and RFPs that show that TEA1 equipment was procured for police and military organizations in countries like Poland, Bulgaria, Croatia, Montenegro, and Moldova, all of which are either EU countries or candidate EU countries. And these procurements were in the last 5 years. So what happened here, we don't know, but it shows that this backdoor algorithm has seeped even into European law enforcement and military networks. But maybe all of this, it's a big nothing burger. Maybe it doesn't matter because nobody actually targets TETRA networks, right? So one of the things that ETSI said in their public statements is that there's no evidence of any attacks on TETRA that we know of. Well, that's very interesting because 2 out of the 5 attacks that we mentioned are passive, so how are you going to spot it? But in addition to that, we found that in the Snowden documents, it shows that there was a joint NSA and Australian Signals Directorate operation in 2007 around the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Bali, where they intercepted the police communications of the Indonesian police, who have a TETRA network, and that way they learned about demonstration routes, they learned the private mobile phone number of the Bali chief of police. Now, we don't know how they did it. They don't mention it in these documents, and it doesn't show proof that our vulnerabilities were exploited, but it does show proof of active targeting of TETRA networks. In some other Snowden documents, we also found evidence of a GCHQ operation in 2009 called Operation Kido. And this was an effects operation against Argentina around the Falklands or Malvinas Islands during a conflict around oil exploration rights. And what they said in this document is that they were collecting high-priority military and leadership communications of Argentina, including a number of TETRA collects, which again shows that these TETRA networks are being targeted. And I mean, everybody can assume this. They're sensitive networks, but yeah, this is hard proof. So what's next? Well, ETSI announced an update to the standard. They're going to replace the authentication suite. They're going to replace the encryption algorithms. They have some mitigations for the keystream recovery attack, but they're going to keep all of those new algorithms secret again. So in the interview, the journalist asked the chairman, well, is ETSI able to make these algorithms public? Are they allowed to do that? And the chairman said, well, I'd have to say yes. And then when the journalist asked, why don't you? The only answer was, well, I don't know. So well, there you have it. So looking at that, should we trust the algorithms TEA6 and 7, which will be the new export-controlled algorithms? What do you guys think? Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads, but let's just ask ETSI themselves. So in that same interview, the chairman said, well, you can trust us because we have no reason to produce dodgy algorithms. I mean, except for the ones that they already did. And then a little bit later, they say, well, the algorithms were just handed to us and they were designed with some assistance from government authorities, let me put it that way. And then at the end, he says, well, look, at the end of the day, it's down to customer organizations to ensure that things are secure enough for them. Now, I agree that's difficult with a private algorithm, but the reason we have 3 different algorithms available must be clear to somebody out there that they're not all as secure as each other. Well, there's going to be 3 new algorithms, which are always secret, so now you know it, they're not going to be all as secure as each other. So if you're buying TETRA networks, now you know. In conclusion, this has been the first public in-depth TETRA security analysis in more than 20 years. This affects more than 100 countries, many different important sectors. We reverse engineered the secret cryptography algorithms, which will be on GitHub. We uncovered multiple vulnerabilities, including a backdoor. There's implications for voice and data communications, as well as SCADA telecontrol. Patches are available for some issues, compensating controls for others. And I'd like to finish this presentation off with a call to action, because there's much more to be looked into for TETRA. First of all, people need to take a closer look at the TIA algorithms, especially that fishy TEA3 S-box. Please, crypt analysts, look at it. People should also take a closer look at that hurdle block cipher, Because in addition to the de-anonymization attack on TA61, that attack provides a foothold for a potential attack onto Hurdle that might be catastrophic for Tetra security, in addition to what we found. If you're a software developer, implement and extend the open Tetra stacks that are out there, so it becomes more available as open technology. And to everybody else out there, please stop doing secret cryptography. It doesn't work, it's a bad idea, it's not polite. Please stop doing it. And with that, I'd like to finish this up. If you'd like to read more, white papers will eventually be available on tetraburst.com. The algorithms will be on GitHub. If you'd like to ask some questions, we'll take them after this presentation, but you can also send us an email on the addresses there if you don't like to ask them in public. And if you do like to ask them in public, I'd like to invite everybody to ask the questions right now. And that's that.
Hello? So have they actually said they're not really interested in any kind of non-proprietary implementation? Like they're just not going to do it or not going to hear it after they hear this talk?
Yeah, so one of the things very early on we said, look, this is stuff from the 90s. We know export controls, Wassenaar, et cetera, et cetera. Why not make it open? And the only kind of answer that we got out of them, well, that's contrary to the nature of the Tetra market. And you can make of that what you will. But it means that they're not going to make this open. They didn't do that for GSM. They didn't do it for 3G, for 4G. So yeah, it's not going to be open. I don't think any of the vendors will adapt open implementations there. So yeah, this is going to be a closed standard, I think, for as long as it will still live. Any other questions? You can also ask them after the talk, but all right, then yeah, for the people who are going to DEF CON, we'll have a talk on Sunday at 2 o'clock. It'll be the closing talk, and there we'll discuss the journey, how we got the algorithms out of the radios, which involved a chain of 0 days getting into the radio, then a bunch of vulnerabilities in a base station to make an attack platform. But we only had 40 minutes here, so yeah, we're going to have to do it there. All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank